"Don't sleep, sir." The little girl's whisper barely reached him over the steady beeping of the monitors. Richard Whitmore's eyelids were already sinking. The world around him felt distant, blurred at the edges. But the voice cut through the fog. "Please," she whispered again, leaning closer. "If you go to sleep now, you won't wake up." A nurse turned sharply. A doctor froze for half a second. And Richard, one of the most powerful men in America, forced his eyes open just long enough to see the little black girl staring not at him, but at the 4-bag hanging above his bed. 3 hours earlier, the intensive care unit on the 7th floor of St. Matthew's Medical Center had been quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional squeak of rubber soles against polished tile. Outside, rain tapped softly against the dark windows overlooking downtown Chicago. Most visitors had gone home. Most patients were asleep. Maya Brooks sat alone on a plastic chair beside a housekeeping cart, waiting for her mother to finish the night shift. At 9 years old, she had become very good at waiting. Waiting in hospital hallways. Waiting outside office buildings when her mother worked overtime. Waiting while adults promised things that rarely happened. Her sneakers barely touched the floor as she swung her legs back and forth. A half-finished carton of chocolate milk rested beside her. The expiration date had passed 2 days ago, but she drank it anyway. Across the corridor, a television mounted high on the wall played muted late-night news. A familiar face appeared on the screen. Richard Whitmore, billionaire, philanthropist, founder of Whitmore Global. The anchor's lips moved silently beneath bright studio lights. Maya recognized him immediately. Everyone did. Even kids in neighborhoods like hers knew who Richard Whitmore was. He owned companies, skyscrapers, and foundations with his name carved into polished stone. Yet tonight he was lying unconscious just 50 feet away. "Maya!" Her mother's voice pulled her attention away from the television. Denise Brooks emerged from a patient room carrying a trash bag. Her blue housekeeping uniform hung loosely on her thin frame. "Stay here, baby. I've only got 2 more rooms." Maya nodded. Denise hesitated. "And don't wander." "I won't." Denise smiled tiredly and pushed the cart away. Maya watched her disappear around the corner. Then her gaze drifted back toward the ICU doors. Room 712. Richard Whitmore's room. She didn't know why she noticed it at first. Maybe because wealthy people attracted attention. Maybe because every nurse seemed unusually tense whenever they entered. Or maybe because something about the room felt wrong. Around 10:30, while waiting for her mother near the nurse's station, Maya noticed a man she had never seen before pushing a medical cart toward room 712. He wasn't wearing scrubs. He wasn't wearing a lab coat. He wore a dark suit and an expensive watch that caught the overhead lights. Nobody stopped him. Nobody questioned him. The man disappeared into Richard Whitmore's room for less than 2 minutes. Then he walked out carrying nothing. Maya frowned. Adults always told children to mind their own business. Usually she did. But as she glanced toward the doorway, something small caught her attention. The new 4-bag hanging beside Richard Whitmore's bed had a label attached to it. Slightly crooked, just enough to look wrong. And for some reason, Maya could not stop staring at it. The label was slightly crooked. Not torn. Not damaged. Just crooked enough that Maya kept looking at it long after the man in the suit disappeared down the hallway. Children noticed strange things adults ignored. A loose button. A missing shoelace. A picture frame hanging a little too low. Maya stared through the narrow glass panel beside room 712 and felt the same quiet discomfort she felt whenever something did not belong where it should. Behind her, the late-night television continued flashing silent headlines. Somewhere down the corridor, a floor buffer hummed against polished tile. The hospital had settled into that strange hour when everything became quieter, yet somehow more unsettling. Maya stood up and walked closer to the door. Richard Whitmore lay motionless beneath a thin white blanket. Tubes ran from his arms. Monitors glowed blue and green in the darkness. The billionaire looked smaller than the man on television. Older too. The kind of tired that money could not fix. Maya pressed her lips together. Then she noticed something else. A nurse entered the room carrying a clipboard. She stopped beside the four-pole and frowned. Only for a second. Then she adjusted the blanket and left. The expression disappeared so quickly Maya almost thought she imagined it. Almost. 15 minutes later Denise returned pushing her cart. "Still here?" she asked softly. "I told you not to wander." "I didn't." Maya pointed toward room 712. "Mom." Denise sighed immediately. "No. You don't even know what I'm gonna say." "I know that look." Denise tied off a trash bag and lowered her voice. "Rich people's problems are not our problems." Maya looked down at her shoes. "What if somebody's lying?" Denise froze for a moment before continuing her work. It was a tiny pause, less than a second. But Maya noticed. "Baby," Denise said carefully, "sometimes grown-ups see things they wish they hadn't." Maya looked at her mother. Denise rarely talked like that. Before Maya could ask what she meant, a hospital pager sounded nearby. Denise gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze and walked away. The conversation ended there, but the feeling didn't. Around 11:20, Maya wandered toward the vending machines near the ICU waiting area. Rain slid down the dark windows in thin silver lines. A cleaning machine rumbled somewhere on another floor. Everything felt ordinary again, until she heard two voices around the corner. One belonged to Dr. Evelyn Hart. Maya recognized it from television interviews. Calm, polished, controlled. The other belonged to a man. "It's already handled," the man said quietly. "Good," Evelyn replied. "Then nobody needs to know." Maya peeked around the corner. The man wore a dark suit. The same dark suit she had seen earlier. Before she could see his face clearly, they separated and walked in opposite directions. Neither noticed her. Maya remained still until they disappeared. Then she walked toward the vending machine and noticed something lying beneath a nearby chair. A small paper receipt. She picked it up. It looked harmless at first. Just coffee. 2 large coffees purchased from the hospital cafe. But the timestamp caught her attention. 10:47 p.m. The receipt had 2 names printed at the bottom. One was Dr. Evelyn Hart. The second made Maya's stomach tighten. It was the same name she had seen earlier on the visitor log outside room 712. And according to that log, the man was never supposed to be in the ICU at all. Maya folded the receipt twice and slipped it into the pocket of her hoodie like it was something fragile. Something hot enough to burn through the cotton if she held it too long. The name at the bottom stayed in her mind even after the paper disappeared. Martin Keller. She had seen it on the visitor log, written in neat black letters beside room 712, but the time beside his name said 8:05 p.m. checkout, 8:18 p.m. The coffee receipt said 10:47. Maya looked down the empty hallway. Rain tapped harder against the windows now, soft but constant, like fingernails on glass. She knew adults made mistakes. Nurses forgot pens. Doctors lost charts. Her mother sometimes wrote the wrong date on grocery lists when she was tired. But visitor logs did not forget people for 2.5 hours. Maya walked back toward the housekeeping cart, keeping one hand over her pocket. Denise was inside a supply closet, wringing out a mop under yellow light. "Mom," Maya whispered. Denise turned, and her face tightened when she saw her daughter's expression. "What now?" Maya pulled out the receipt. The man in the suit was still here after he signed out. Denise's eyes dropped to the paper, then moved quickly toward the hallway. "Put that away." But he went into Mr. Whitmore's room. "Maya." Denise's voice was quiet, but sharper now. "Do you understand what happens when people like us accuse people like them?" Maya swallowed. "I'm not accusing. I'm remembering." Denise closed her eyes for a second. The words hurt more because they sounded like something she had taught her. Before she could answer, footsteps approached. Dr. Evelyn Hart appeared at the end of the hall, her white coat clean, her hair pinned perfectly, her face arranged into the kind of calm that made other people feel messy for being afraid. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Denise stepped in front of Maya slightly. "Yes, doctor. We're finishing this section." Evelyn's gaze lowered to Maya's pocket. "Not long. Just enough. Children shouldn't be wandering near ICU at night. she said softly. It can frighten patients. Maya said nothing. Evelyn smiled, but the smile did not reach her eyes. Especially very sick patients who need rest. The word rest landed wrong. Too smooth, too practiced. From inside room 712, a monitor gave a low, uneven chirp, and everyone turned. Richard Whitmore's eyes were open. Not wide, not alert, but open. Evelyn moved first, crossing into the room with practiced urgency. Denise stayed frozen in the hallway. Maya stepped just close enough to see through the glass. Richard's hand shifted against the sheet. His fingers curled once, weakly, toward the four-pole. Evelyn leaned over him and murmured something Maya could not hear. Then Richard's eyes moved past the doctor, past the machines, and found Maya in the doorway. For one thin second, the billionaire looked at the little girl as if he recognized fear when it was telling the truth. Maya slowly lifted the folded receipt between two fingers. Evelyn saw it reflected in the dark window beside Richard's bed, and her hand, the one holding the syringe, stopped in midair. The syringe remained motionless for only a fraction of a second before Dr. Evelyn Hart lowered her hand and slipped it calmly into the pocket of her white coat. Her expression never cracked. If Maya had blinked, she might have missed the hesitation entirely. "Mr. Whitmore needs rest," Evelyn said evenly. "Please step away from the door." Denise immediately touched Maya's shoulder. "Come on, baby." But Maya stayed where she was. Inside room 712, Richard Whitmore's eyes were still open, heavy, struggling, yet watching. A few moments later, the hallway changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just the way powerful places always changed when important people arrived. A man in a tailored charcoal suit stepped out of the elevator carrying a leather portfolio. Another followed behind him, then a third. Their shoes clicked softly against the polished floor. No one rushed them. No one questioned them. Nurses moved aside automatically. One of the men approached the nurse's station. "Martin Keller is here regarding Mr. Whitmore," he said. Maya recognized the name immediately. The receipt in her pocket suddenly felt heavier. The man turned and noticed her standing near the ICU door. His smile appeared instantly. Professional, pleasant, empty. "And who might this young lady be?" he asked. Before Maya could answer, Evelyn spoke first. "The daughter of one of our housekeeping staff." The wording was subtle. Not Maya Brooks, not a witness, not a child. Just the daughter of housekeeping staff. Something smaller, easier to dismiss. Martin nodded as though that explained everything. "I see." Then he looked at Denise. "I'm sure you understand the importance of patient privacy." Denise lowered her eyes. "Of course." "Good." His tone remained polite. "Then perhaps your daughter should avoid spending time around sensitive medical situations." Maya watched him carefully. He sounded reasonable. That was what made it worse. He never called her a liar. He never raised his voice. He simply spoke as if her observations could not possibly matter. Nearby, two board members from Whitmore Foundation arrived carrying rain-speckled coats. One glanced toward Maya and quietly asked, "Is that the child causing confusion?" Confusion, not concern, not questions, just confusion. Richard heard some of it through the partially open door. His gaze drifted toward the hallway again. He saw the men in suits, saw Maya standing beside the cleaning cart, saw how every adult seemed to be speaking around her rather than to her. Then Martin stepped inside the room. "Richard," he said warmly, "you gave us quite a scare." The billionaire said nothing. Martin continued, "Everyone's worried about you. We're handling everything. The board, the foundation, the company." Richard's eyes moved slowly toward the four-pole, then back to Martin. Tiny pause, barely noticeable, but it was there. Meanwhile, outside, Denise gently tried to guide Maya away. "Let it go," she whispered. "Please." Maya's fingers tightened around the folded receipt. "Mom," she said quietly, "why does everybody keep saying he needs rest?" Denise didn't answer. Maya looked through the glass again. Dr. Evelyn was adjusting something on a tablet connected to the four-pump. Martin stood beside her. Both appeared calm, controlled, finished, as if the situation had already been resolved. Then Maya noticed a reflection in the dark window beside Richard's bed. Not the people, not the machines, the screen. For less than a second, before Evelyn turned the tablet away, a medication schedule flashed across the glass. Maya couldn't read all of it. Only one line, one word, one timestamp. The dosage adjustment had been entered at 10:52 p.m., 5 minutes after the coffee receipt was printed. And according to the chart hanging at the foot of Richard Whitmore's bed, the medication change was supposed to have happened at 8:15. The dosage adjustment had been entered at 10:52 p.m., 5 minutes after the coffee receipt was printed. And according to the chart hanging at the foot of Richard Whitmore's bed, the medication change was supposed to have happened at 8:15. Maya stared at the reflection until Dr. Evelyn turned the tablet away. The numbers vanished instantly. But once Maya saw something, she rarely forgot it. Martin Keller and the board members remained inside the room for another 10 minutes. They spoke in low, careful voices, the kind of voices adults used when they wanted to sound transparent while hiding the most important part of the conversation. Richard listened without appearing to listen. Years in boardrooms had taught him that silence revealed more than questions. When the men finally stepped out, Evelyn stayed behind. She checked his pulse, adjusted his blanket, smoothed the corner of the sheet near his shoulder. Every movement looked kind. Every movement looked practiced. "You need rest," she said softly. "Everything else can wait until morning." Richard watched her face. He had trusted that face for 6 years. Trusted her through surgeries, treatments, and sleepless nights after his wife died. Trusted her with information he never shared with reporters, lawyers, or even some family members. Yet for the first time, something felt slightly out of alignment, like a picture hanging, half an inch crooked on a wall. Not enough to prove anything, enough to notice. After Evelyn left, the hallway settled again. Rain continued tapping against the windows. Somewhere downstairs, a vending machine dropped a soda with a metallic clunk. Maya sat beside the housekeeping cart while Denise finished cleaning another wing. She kept replaying everything in her head. The receipt, the visitor log, the tablet reflection. Then she remembered something else. Earlier that evening, before the man in the suit entered room 712, she had seen a discarded 4 bag in a medical waste container near the service elevator. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it did. Maya stood up. "Mom, I'm going to the restroom." Denise barely looked up from her mop bucket. 2 minutes. Maya nodded and headed in the opposite direction. The service corridor near the waste processing room was almost empty. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The air smelled faintly of bleach and plastic. She reached the container she remembered and looked inside. Most of the contents had already been collected. Most. Near the bottom, partially hidden beneath packaging, was the same 4 bag. Maya carefully pulled it free. The label was wrinkled but readable. She stared at it, then stared again. The medication name printed there was different from the one she had seen reflected on the tablet. Completely different. Her heart began beating faster. She folded the bag and slipped it beneath her hoodie. By the time she returned upstairs, her hands were shaking. Not from fear, from certainty. She waited until Denise disappeared into another room before approaching room 712. Richard was awake again. Barely. His eyes opened as Maya stepped through the doorway. Neither spoke immediately. The machines filled the silence. Maya pulled the folded 4 bag from beneath her hoodie and placed it gently on the blanket near his hand. Richard looked confused. Then he looked at the label. His gaze lingered. Longer than before. Much longer. Slowly he reached toward the bag. His fingers brushed the printed medication name. A memory surfaced. Not from tonight. From 3 months earlier. During a private meeting with Evelyn after a routine treatment. He remembered asking why she had suddenly changed one of his medications. He remembered her answer. He remembered accepting it without question. Richard stared at the label again. Then at the 4 hanging beside his bed. Then back at the label. The color drained from his face. Maya saw it happen. saw the exact moment the billionaire stopped looking at the evidence as a child's suspicion and started looking at it as a possibility. Richard lifted his eyes toward the doorway. Dr. Evelyn Hart was standing there, watching them, and for the first time in 6 years, Richard Whitmore found himself wondering whether the person he trusted most had just lied to him. Richard Whitmore kept his eyes on Dr. Evelyn Hart until she finally stepped away from the doorway. She offered the same calm smile she had offered hundreds of times before, the same reassuring nod, the same steady confidence that had once made him feel safe. Then she left, and the room became quiet except for the soft rhythm of machines and the rain sliding down the dark hospital windows. Richard did not touch the call button. He did not confront anyone. He simply lay there staring at the folded-for bag Maya had placed on his blanket. Years of business had taught him one lesson above all others. When something felt wrong, the loudest person in the room usually learned the least. Across the room, Maya remained near the door. She expected questions. Instead, Richard spoke only once. His voice was rough from exhaustion. "Can you read?" Maya blinked. "Yes, sir." Richard lifted a trembling finger toward the label on the discarded bag. "Read that medication name." Maya read it carefully. Then Richard closed his eyes. Not because he trusted her. Because he remembered. 3 months ago, Evelyn had assured him that medication had been permanently discontinued after complications. Yet here it was again. Different label. Different date. Same drug. A few minutes later, a nurse entered to check his vitals. Richard waited until she finished. "Could you bring me my tablet?" he asked quietly. "Dr. Hart said you should rest." Richard managed a faint smile.
"I'm asking anyway."
The nurse hesitated, then nodded. 10 minutes later, he was alone with the device. Maya watched from her chair while he opened hospital records. Financial reports. Treatment schedules. Nothing dramatic. Nothing obvious. Just small details. Timestamps. Authorization codes. Medication changes. The sort of information most people ignored. Twice he took screenshots. Once he saved a PDF. Then he deleted the browsing history. Maya noticed that too. Around midnight, the hospital settled into a deeper silence. Somewhere down the hall, a television murmured from an overnight waiting room. The distant sound of a washing machine echoed through the service floor below. Denise returned with 2 cups of vending machine hot chocolate. She handed one to Maya. "You should sleep." Maya shook her head. "Mom." Denise sighed. "What?" Maya glanced toward Richard's room. "If somebody's lying, and nobody says anything, does that make everybody part of the lie?" Denise stared into her paper cup for a long moment. "Sometimes," she answered quietly. "Sometimes it does." Maya nodded. That was all. She never asked about rewards. Never asked what Richard Whitmore was worth. Never asked whether rich people paid money for information. The only thing she asked was, "If they're hurting him, can we stop it?" Denise looked away before answering. Back inside the ICU room, Richard opened an older file buried deep in his records.
À personnel autorisation document.
Something he had not looked at in years. He compared signatures, compared dates, compared approval chains. His pulse monitor began ticking slightly faster. Then he picked up his phone and typed a short message to the only person he still trusted completely. Not a board member. Not an executive. Not a doctor. A retired forensic accountant named Harold Finch who had worked with him for nearly 20 years. Richard sent a single sentence. Review every medication authorization from the last 6 months. Do not tell anyone. The message disappeared into the night. Less than 5 minutes later, Maya noticed movement near the nurse's station. Dr. Evelyn had returned. She wasn't looking at Richard's room. She was looking at the hospital security office across the corridor. A young employee handed her a clipboard. Evelyn signed something and left. 20 minutes later, Richard received an automated notification from the hospital portal. Security footage request unavailable. File archived. Richard stared at the message. Then at the timestamp. The footage had been archived exactly 7 minutes after Harold Finch received his text. For a long time he said nothing. Then he slowly looked toward the doorway where Maya sat holding her untouched cup of hot chocolate. And for the first time, Richard Whitmore realized he may not have spent 6 years trusting the wrong medication. He may have spent 6 years trusting the wrong person. Richard Whitmore did not mention the archived footage to anyone the next morning. He did not accuse Dr. Evelyn Hart. He did not confront Martin Keller. He simply watched. By sunrise, pale gray light had replaced the blue glow of the ICU. Rainwater still clung to the hospital windows. Nurses changed shifts. Coffee carts rattled down the hallway. Everything looked normal. That was exactly what made Richard suspicious. Around 8 o'clock, Harold Finch finally replied to the message. The response contained only 6 words. Check who approved the override. Richard read the sentence twice. Then he opened the medication records again. A treatment override had been entered 3 weeks earlier. The approval field contained a name he knew well. Martin Keller. Richard stared at the screen without reacting. Across the room, Maya sat quietly beside her mother's housekeeping cart, drawing circles on the back of a discarded cafeteria menu. She looked like an ordinary child waiting for an adult to finish work. But Richard had begun to understand something important. Maya remembered details because nobody ever expected her to matter. That afternoon he asked for a routine consultation meeting. Nothing unusual. Just himself, Dr. Evelyn, Martin Keller, and one hospital administrator. Everyone agreed immediately. Powerful people rarely feared ordinary conversations. The meeting took place in a private conference room overlooking the hospital courtyard. A camera used for internal documentation blinked softly in one corner. A pitcher of water sat untouched in the center of the table. Martin arrived first. Evelyn followed a minute later. Both appeared calm, professional, prepared. Richard remained polite. "I've been reviewing my treatment records," he said. "There are a few details I'd like clarified." Nobody looked alarmed. "Not yet." Evelyn folded her hands neatly. "Of course." Richard slid a copy of the medication report across the table. "Could you explain why this authorization required legal approval?" Martin answered smoothly. "Liability protection. Standard procedure." The response came too quickly. Richard nodded as if satisfied. Then he asked a second question. "And the medication itself?" Evelyn smiled gently. "You approved that treatment months ago." Richard remained silent. Across the room, Maya sat beside Denise near the doorway. Officially, she was waiting for her mother. Unofficially, she was watching. Her eyes drifted toward the water pitcher, then toward Martin, then back toward the pitcher. Something bothered her. The feeling nagged at her for several minutes before she finally understood why. Her hand rose slightly. "Sir." Every adult in the room looked at her. Martin's expression tightened almost invisibly. Richard turned. "Yes, Maya?" "The water." Martin laughed softly. "What about it?" Maya pointed toward the glasses arranged beside the pitcher. "There are 4 glasses." The room fell quiet. "And?" Martin asked. Maya shrugged. "There were 5 when we came in." Nobody spoke. Such a small observation sounded ridiculous, childish, meaningless. Yet Richard saw something happen. Martin glanced toward Evelyn before answering. Just a fraction of a second. The kind of glance people made when checking whether another person knew something. "Perhaps housekeeping removed one," Martin said. Denise shook her head immediately. "No, sir." Another silence. The camera light continued blinking. Red, red, red. Richard leaned back slightly. "Interesting." Martin reached for the pitcher. His hand stopped halfway. He lowered it again. Nobody touched the water. Nobody touched the glasses. The administrator looked confused. Evelyn remained composed, but her smile no longer looked effortless. Then, Richard asked one final question, very softly. "Dr. Hart, can you remind me exactly when my medication dosage was changed?" Evelyn answered, 8:15 p.m. The response arrived instantly. Too instantly. Maya looked down at the folded coffee receipt she still carried. Then she looked back up. "That's funny," she said quietly. Because at 8:15 you were drinking coffee with Mr. Keller. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The blinking camera recorded every second of the silence. And for the first time since this began, Dr. Evelyn Hart looked at Maya not as a child, but as a threat. Then her eyes shifted to Richard, and in that moment, she understood something far worse. The little girl was no longer standing alone. The silence after Maya's words seemed to stretch across the entire conference room. No one reached for the water. No one looked at the blinking camera anymore. Dr. Evelyn Hart lowered her eyes for the first time since the meeting began. Only for a moment. Then she recovered. "A child is confusing two different events," she said calmly. "That happens." Martin Keller nodded immediately. "Exactly." Richard said nothing. His expression remained unreadable. Then his phone vibrated once against the table. Everyone heard it. Nobody moved. Richard glanced at the screen. Harold Finch. One attachment. One sentence. "Check the archived file before they remove it." Richard opened the attachment. The room remained perfectly quiet except for the faint hum of air conditioning. The file took several seconds to load. Long enough for Martin to clear his throat. Long enough for Evelyn to fold her hands tighter. Long enough for Maya to notice that neither of them was looking at Richard anymore. They were looking at his phone. Finally, the file opened. Security footage. Grainy. Black and white. Timestamp. 10:51 p.m. The supposedly archived recording had survived because the hospital's backup server had copied it automatically before deletion. Richard watched without speaking. A service corridor appeared on the screen. A medical waste container. Then a figure entered the frame. Martin Keller. Not a nurse. Not a pharmacist. Martin himself. He wheeled a cart carrying medication supplies. 23 seconds later, Dr. Evelyn Hart entered from the opposite side. She handed him something. A bag. The image wasn't perfect, but the object was unmistakable. And for bag. Nobody in the room spoke. Richard kept watching. The recording continued. Martin removed one bag from the cart. Evelyn attached a different one. Then both disappeared toward ICU. The timestamp remained visible in the corner. 10:52 p.m. The exact minute the dosage change had been entered. Richard slowly lowered the phone. Martin opened his mouth. Closed it again. Evelyn looked toward the administrator. The footage lacks context. Her voice sounded thinner now. "There may be an explanation." Richard still said nothing. Then Harold sent a second file. A financial report. The billionaire opened it. This time his hand stopped moving entirely. The room faded around him. Numbers filled the screen. Transfers. Foundation accounts. Medical grants. Pediatric treatment funds. Donations made under the Whitmore Foundation name. Millions of dollars redirected through shell organizations. Years of it. Richard's eyes scanned line after line. Then they landed on a familiar document. A denied emergency treatment request from 4 years earlier. Attached to the application was a patient file. Male. Age 7. Severe cardiac condition. Application rejected due to unavailable funds. Richard stared at the photograph clipped to the report. The last name hit him first. Brooks. Then the address. Then the date. He looked across the room toward Denise. Denise froze. Maya looked confused. Richard felt something collapse quietly inside him. The funds had existed. They had always existed. They had simply been stolen before reaching the children they were meant to save. The boy in the file had been Maya's younger brother. The foundation carrying Richard's name had denied help while executives he trusted moved money elsewhere. Richard's face went pale. He could not speak. Not because of the poisoning. Not because of betrayal. Because he suddenly understood that while he attended galas, gave speeches, and accepted awards, a child had died under the protection of a charity that was supposed to save him. Denise lowered her eyes. Maya looked between them without understanding everything, but understanding enough. Richard finally raised his head. Martin Keller looked away first. Dr. Evelyn Hart looked down at the table. The administrator sat frozen. Richard reached forward. Calmly, deliberately, He placed the phone containing the footage beside the financial report. Then he slid both documents into the center of the table. Nobody stopped him. Nobody argued. Nobody even breathed loudly. Richard's voice, when it finally came, was quiet enough that everyone leaned forward to hear it. "Call my attorney." The room remained silent for several seconds after Richard Whitmore spoke. Nobody argued. Nobody rushed to explain. The evidence sitting on the conference table had stripped away every comfortable excuse. By noon, attorneys arrived. Not Martin Keller's attorneys. Richard's. Independent counsel. Outside investigators. Compliance officers. The kind of people who carried legal pads instead of opinions. The hospital administration launched an emergency review. The board of Whitmore Foundation called a special session. Security footage was preserved. Financial records were frozen. Within 48 hours, Martin Keller was removed from every position connected to the foundation pending criminal investigation. Dr. Evelyn Hart was suspended from medical practice privileges, while state regulators reviewed patient records. Neither left the building in handcuffs. Real consequences rarely happen that way. Instead, they left under the weight of documents, audits, sworn statements, and questions they could no longer control. The headlines arrived later. The truth arrived first. Richard remained in the hospital another week. During that time, he learned things he wished he had known years earlier. He learned how many treatment requests had been denied while money sat in accounts bearing his name. He learned how many families stopped answering foundation letters because they had lost faith. He learned that Denise Brooks had worked double shifts for years without ever complaining to anyone important enough to hear it. One afternoon, he asked to see her. Denise entered. Cautiously, still wearing her housekeeping uniform. "You wanted to speak with me?" Richard nodded. "I owe you an apology." Denise looked genuinely confused. Powerful men rarely apologized to people who cleaned their floors. "For what?" she asked. Richard glanced toward the window. "For building something that carried my name and never noticing who it was hurting." Denise said nothing. Some apologies were too late to fix everything. But they still mattered. A month later, Whitmore Foundation publicly announced major reforms. Independent oversight. Full financial transparency. Emergency pediatric funding restored. Families whose applications had been mishandled received direct legal assistance and review. Denise was offered a position on a patient advocacy advisory board. Not because she was connected to Richard, because she understood what happened when ordinary people were ignored. She accepted only after reading every page herself. Maya approved of that. As for Maya, she received attention she never wanted. Reporters called. Local news stations requested interviews. She declined all of them. The only thing she agreed to do was meet with a group of hospital administrators who wanted to thank her. When they finished praising her bravery, Maya asked a simple question. "Are you going to listen to the next kid who says something is wrong?" Nobody answered immediately. That was answer enough. Winter arrived early that year. One evening, several months later, Richard drove himself to a modest apartment building on the south side of Chicago.
No assistants. No cameras.
No press releases. Just a quiet visit. Denise opened the door. Maya sat at the kitchen table doing homework beneath a warm yellow light. The apartment looked different now. Safe. Repaired. The unpaid medical debt connected to her brother's treatment had been cleared through legal restitution. Denise had stable benefits. Maya's education fund had been established. Not as charity, as accountability. Richard noticed an old phone sitting on the counter. The same cracked phone Maya had used to save evidence. "You kept it," he said. Maya nodded. "It still works." Richard smiled. "Barely." Denise placed 3 glasses on the table. One contained milk. Maya wrapped both hands around it. For a few minutes, nobody talked about investigations or lawsuits or foundations. They talked about school, snow forecasts, a science project, ordinary things, the kind of things families should have time to discuss. Eventually, Richard stood to leave. Maya walked him to the door. "Sir?" she said. Richard stopped. "Yes." Maya thought for a moment. My mom always said rich people can buy almost anything. Richard waited. But they still have to listen. Richard looked at her. Then at the apartment behind her. The warm kitchen light. The old phone. The glass of milk still sitting on the table. For a long moment he could not find the right words. Finally he nodded once. Quietly. Because the little girl was right. And because the truth had won not when power spoke the loudest, but when someone everyone overlooked was finally heard.